Good evening, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer. Hope everybody out there is doing really well today. Welcome to Modern Horizon Spoilers Part 3, The Unearthing. Before we begin, let us thank our brand new Patreon supporters. We have D.A. Binder, who is a confidant. Welcome to the fold, my friend. Thank you so much for your support. We also have Schneier. I hope I got both of those names correct. Probably didn't. Schneier hails all the way from Iceland and is a member of the tier list here. So thank you so much, my friends, for that generous support. Thank you to all Patreon supporters, as always, and we are going to talk about several new potentially playable cards from Modern Horizons right now for the Golgari midrange deck. We're going to talk about Dead of Winter, Yawgmoth Thran Physician, Endling, Nether Spirit, Weather the Storm, Collector Ouphe, or Ouphe, however you say that, and, of course, the namesake card of this video, Unearth. So, thanks again for your support. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe to this channel if you are enjoying this content. And without further ado, let's talk about the first card. Alright, my friends, so first up is the card Dead of Winter. Now, I am a sucker for the snow theme. The snow mechanics, as little as they've been involved in the game relatively up until now, I've still always loved them. When I was a kitchen table player, I made so many cold snap snow-themed decks that were terrible but really cool. And this card is just amazing in every way. Dead of Winter, great name. This art is just stunning. I want this art on a playmat. The flavor text by Tevesh Sat, however you say that, at last silence. We just love this card. And it is the closest approximation we are going to get, it seems, to a card that would be a snap inclusion in our deck, Toxic Deluge. So, despite all of that, I think this is not playable in our deck, and the reason I gave you that spiel at the beginning is because I, of all people, am as favorably disposed as it's possible to be to a card like this. I'm really in the market for a good 3-mana sweeper that you can kind of, control the size of. I love everything about this card, like I said. It's just not good enough, in my opinion. Now, minor caveat here. If they print more Golgari playable snow permanents, then of course all of this changes. However, with how the snow mechanics have been unfolding thus far, I really do not expect that to happen at all. It's just not likely. So if we assume that the only snow permanents we can realistically leverage are our basic lands, this is simply not good enough. A majority of even our land permanents will not produce, are not snow, and therefore will not contribute to the power of the card Dead of Winter. And if anything, most Golgari lists run 6 basic lands, and that's, I think, correct right now. But if anything, with nurturing peatland entering the format, and with other utility lands, like Blast Zone that recently entered and perhaps are pushing for a spot as well, there are even fewer, there are incentives to run even fewer than 6 basic lands. Now, I'm not saying that I'm going to cut basic lands. I'm gonna really take a good hard look at the land base once the full spoiler is out, but I think at most we are going to be running the same number of basics. You certainly should not be running more basic lands just to get more snow permanents to make this card better. So, as much as I would love nothing more than to be sleeving up this awesome, awesome card, I do not think it is a good fit for Golgari midrange. Next up is Yawgmoth Thran Physician. Now, I think a lot of people's eyes lit up when this card was spoiled, because of course Yawgmoth looms large in the kind of ancient lore of this game, and it's right in our colors, a nice friendly casting cost. It's kind of at the top of our curve, and it's got all kinds of really cool abilities. Protection from humans looks really cool. It's got a sack outlet that caches, that can potentially kill a creature and draws you a card. And then you can cash in dead cards in hand to proliferate. So this guy does a whole lot, and it's very, very cool card, very well designed. I know some people were a little bit underwhelmed by the power level, maybe because of again, storyline reasons, but this is, of course, pre-transformation or whatever, and I think, not every powerful card in lore can be just game-breakingly good in every format, right? And make no mistake, when this card is uncontested and in the right shell, it is going to be a game winner. I just don't think that shell is ours. So protection from humans. Now, this is pretty relevant in the modern format. Of course, humans are the #1 deck of the meta at the time of the recording of this video. But against the human tribal deck specifically, by the time you play a Yawgmoth, the opponent has probably been clocking you fairly well, and is trying to close out the game with evasive attackers, with attackers up in the sky. And this protection is therefore not all that relevant in terms of stabilizing you. And of course, as an attacker on a clogged up board, they can't be blocked by any humans, but the 2 power really lets it down there. Now, I'm really high on the card Plague Engineer in general, partially because there are so many decks, not beyond human tribal, where you can name humans, and it's pretty good. So, don't get me wrong, protection from humans. Humans are ubiquitous in Modern. This is very, very relevant, but all things considered, given the body, given the nature of Modern, it's just not like a real total selling point for the card. But alright, what else does it have? Pay 1 life, sack another creature, put a -1/-1 counter, and draw a card. Now that's just amazing value. You can imagine the perfect scenario where you're sacrificing a creature that is surplus to requirements, and then for the mere cost of 1 life, you get to kill an X1 and draw a card. Like, the value is outrageous. Here's the problem: we don't play that many sacrificial lambs in this deck. Yes, there are situations where, the opponent's got a Rest in Peace down and your Tarmogoyf is a 0/1. Sure, it would be amazing to cash it in. You can be low on life and you want to kill your Bob and get value out of it. Well, that's just great. Perfect. But realistically speaking, we are a deck that tries to ride 1 or 2 threats to victory and snowball them. None of them are expendable at all in a vacuum, quite the opposite. So this is just not very good in our shell, even if you can come up with scenarios where it would be good. Overall, this runs at cross purposes to what we're attempting to do. Finally, we have 2 black mana, discard a card, proliferate. So obviously you can imagine where this is great to make his -1/-1 counters even better. And admittedly, we do play a lot of creatures and planeswalkers that can get counters. Of course, planeswalkers always have counters, but we play Scavenging Ooze and Tireless Tracker and Kalitas that do benefit from proliferate. Here's the problem: this is so incredibly win more to proliferate. If we are untapping with any of the aforementioned permanents and sinking mana into them, accruing counters on the Skoos or the Kalitas or the Tracker, we are winning anyway. We don't need to proliferate to win a little bit harder. We are winning anyway. And we all know how good it is to have the option to pitch dead cards to our Liliana +1, so, we don't feel bad about losing a piece of gas out of our hand, or even to make our Collective Brutality even better. So we understand the value of pitching cards, but we just don't want to overload on those effects because very often we don't have a card we want to pitch. So all things considered, in an alternative universe meta where we're playing a lot of suddenly expendable creatures and where he's going to kill a lot of X1s and the games are really fair and grindy, but humans are still everywhere, Yawgmoth is a fine curve topper, a fun and powerful when uncontested curve topper. But right now in the meta, I almost feel increasingly, especially after this set, we might barely have room for a card like Kalitas, which is absolutely backbreakingly good against so many meta decks and against aggro decks in general, that comparing Yawgmoth to Kalitas, who is his main competition, I think Yawgmoth does fall short. So if you want to play this guy for fun, as your spicy fun of, as, a change of pace for FNM, by all means, there are definitely worse cards. This is far from an embarrassing card to sleeve up in the Golgari deck. However, I don't think he is going to be, right now as things stand, anywhere near the optimal tuned 75 that we can come up with for our archetype. Speaking of value 4-drops, next up we have Endling. Very comparable again to Yawgmoth, and of course it also competes with Kalitas. Now, lots of cool stuff, lots to like about this. The mana sink, the sheer flexibility. Menace and Death Touch kind of operate on both ends of the spectrum in terms of how the attacks and blocks are set up on a clogged board. The pump the power at the expense of the toughness or vice versa is a really nice flexible ability to have. Ultimately, though, I think these Ling cards, this Shapeshifter cycle, they're a little bit too cute to be very good in Modern, simply because Modern decks are so fast that you don't necessarily have time to really sink mana into it. Now, the principle of mana sinks in general, it's solid to have some of those in your deck, but we need them to do things like Scavenging Ooze and Tireless Tracker do for us, aka disrupt heavily in the case of Skoos, or draw toward a overwhelming density of card advantage like Tireless Tracker does. All the Endling mana sink does is just kind of make Endling mana itself better. Doesn't really stop the opponent from doing what they're doing for the most part, and doesn't really progress us toward an overwhelming advantage. It's just a creature that is always decent if the game goes on long enough, is basically what you can say for it. I would advise everybody to not have your heads turned by these flashy, rare, mythic, rare curve toppers. All of our threats already snowball a game if they're left unchecked. We need better interaction. That's really what we need. Our creatures are already very good. It's going to be tough to displace a lot of them. Now, of course, I'm mentioning Endling like I'm mentioning other cards like Yawgmoth and Dead of Winter, partially because people have asked me, is this good, is this playable? So I want to address all of those. Also because I do want to call attention to the Undying ability. Now, if this was a little bit more easily achieved, like if this was a 3-drop and it was a little bit worse but it still had Undying, this would be a lot more interesting. Make no mistake, Undying on a card like this is actually really, really, really nice. The big problem with that in this case is, of course, it's already a 4-drop. If we assume that its value is linked to Undying being good, which I think is the case, then it is, for all intents and purposes, a 5-drop, and it's a 5-drop that doesn't even, dodge Fatal Push. So it's kind of like a worse 5-drop than a literal 5-drop in a weird way, and I just think that's too slow. I think it's too slow, it's too cute, but it is worth noting that Undying is actually probably a lot better than it looks. I think people are either overrating this card because it's a flashy thing that does a lot of stuff and it'd be really fun to use, or they're saying, it's just trash and they're kind of underrating it, and I think Undying is the key to evaluating it correctly. I still don't think this should be played in our deck, but I just wanted to give you my thoughts on this card. Alright, my friends, next up we will briefly mention the card Nether Spirit. Now, of course, we have this lovely Mercadian Masks old-style foil printing, which I love. We have the new one, too. The new one's interesting art and all that, but I love the simplicity of the old stuff. You guys know that by now. I'm a sucker for it. So, Nether Spirit. Unlike the other cards we've mentioned, I am mentioning this because I don't think people have given this card its due. Now, full disclaimer, I don't think we should be playing it right now. But I think it is actually conceivably more testable than some of the other cards we've already talked about here for one reason and one reason alone. Modern shows us over and over and over again the power of free spells. Everything from Surgical Extraction making a lot of main decks these days, to the rise of Arclight Phoenix to the very top tiers of Modern, to, basically the whole Dredge deck, and you name it. Free spells are good. Free spells are consistently underrated, and then all of a sudden they're busted. Nether Spirit is a free spell at the beginning of your upkeep. If it's the only creature card in your graveyard, you may return it to play. And do note that we play like a medium level of threat density, and we don't always have that many, if any, creatures in our graveyard, so you can imagine scenarios in which you're able to pitch Fist for Value, to Collective Brutality, or to Liliana, or you just hard cast it and chump block with it or trade off with it, and then you keep getting it back, and you keep getting it back. Or you could mill it over blindly with Liliana the Last Hope. So I just want to draw people's attention to this card. Again, the notion of free spells is a very, very, very consistently proven powerful one in the Modern format. However, I don't think this is in our deck right now. It's a little too slow, a little too fair. At the end of the day, it's free, but it is still only a 2/2. Not that impressive compared to a lot of other things that are out there, free or otherwise. But it is worth mentioning that I think, relative to some other cards that are getting a little bit overhyped, this card is flying under the radar. So, if you feel like testing it, you could do worse than giving this thing a run out as a one-of, or, just in general keeping it on the back burner. If nothing else, I think it's a useful thing to remember in terms of evaluating cards in the future. So ultimately, I don't recommend you play Nether Spirit in your deck right now, but it is, maybe needs a little bit more love than it's been getting. Okay, my friends, next up we will talk about Weather the Storm, and this is a kind of elegant in its simplicity, gain 3 life storm. That's all it does. So, how do we rate this card? Well, as far as I can tell, it's namely useful against 3 modern decks. I'm thinking, of course, of Storm, the deck, because ironically, most Storm cards are good against the Storm deck. Thinking also, of course, of Burn. Any life gain effect that you have anywhere in your 75 comes in against Burn without question. And finally, Izzet Phoenix. Now, let's talk about these in reverse order. So against Phoenix, admittedly, there are games where they barely get you, and their reach does matter. Like, you had them dead on board, and their Lightning Bolt closed out the game. Obviously, Weather the Storm can save you in situations like that when other cards may not. And obviously, Izzet Phoenix is a deck that's trying to chain 3+ spells together on their big go-off turns, so Weather the Storm can, in theory, gain a nice big chunk of life, and of course, if the game comes down to the wire like that, then all to the better. The problem is, it's not a burn deck, unless one deck or the other of ours or Burns is really struggling, burn games often do come down to the wire, where those chunks of life make or break the outcome of the game. Izzet Phoenix, that's far from guaranteed. For every game where it does come down to the wire, you probably have 2 or 3 games where you are either just crushing them and, disrupting heavily while you clock with a Goyf, or you've desperately maybe stopped them from going off and they just slam a 12-4 Crackling Drake, and that thing just kills you. Weather the Storm looks pretty embarrassing against a gigantic Crackling Drake. And they have grindy value out of the side in the form of Planeswalkers. They have Pyromancer Ascension for kind of inevitability. And of course, against Phoenixes, this, if they do go off with Phoenixes, this buys you a turn at best. So, while you might bring it in if it's already in your 75 against Phoenix, I don't think it's necessarily all that impressive there. Good sometimes, respectable others, kind of meh some of the time as well. Maybe we just want to be more proactive than this in that matchup. And now against the Storm deck itself, of course, this is a really nice counter to a massive Grape Shot, but the problem is post-side, if you're doing your job right, they're probably not going to get a massive Grape Shot. The bigger danger is, of course, like a medium-sized Empty the Warrens, probably when we're tapped out, so we can't even, get a big chunk of life there in response, and then, kind of getting whittled down from there. So, again, probably a card that you'd bring in that matchup if it's already in your 75, but I don't believe that it should be in your 75 for that matchup. So really, this, more than anything, is this worthy anti-burn tech? And of course it is worthy anti-burn tech, especially if you're sequencing in such a way where you can just, kind of bait them into casting multiple spells, and then reaping the benefits from that, kind of unwinding the burn clock a lot with like a nice healthy Weather the Storm for 9 or even more if it's mid-game and you have the mana and you cast a spell of your own in the mix maybe. It's just definitely going to be anywhere from good to game-winning against burn. There's no doubt of that. However, I would compare it to a card like Life Goes On. It's hard to say which one's better or worse. Of course, Life Goes On is cheaper and kind of has a narrower range. It's either 4 life or 8 life if the creature died. This goes from a floor of 3 all the way up to, I don't know what's realistic, maybe 15. Which is just game-winning against burn. But, you've got to play around the Skullcrack effect too. So part of the reason I think Life Goes On does not see as much play, and therefore maybe Weather the Storm is also not going to see that much play, is because we are not consistently racing burn all that well. We're not a tribal aggro deck that wants to just put the pedal to the metal and gain a little bit of life along the way. We are sometimes racing them, kind of sometimes like the Izzet Phoenix games are close, but more often than not, we are trying to really stabilize and just take over the game, run them out of resources, empty their hand with discard and Liliana's, attack the mana base with Fulminator Mage, take over with a huge value creature like Scavenging Ooze or Kalitas. So these one-shot life gain effects, while again, of course, they're going to be some of your best cards if they're in your 75 and you bring them in against burn, I just think they're a little bit counter. They run a little bit counter to our normal game plan. So very testable, very playable. It's possible that I am underrating it. And it is also worth saying that burn will, mark my words, will see a big spike in play when Modern Horizons is live, if nothing else than because of the Horizon lands, which are good in burn and good for burn to prey upon in opposing decks. So if you want to tech up against burn, post Horizons is going to be the time to do so, and Weather the Storm is very playable. But right now, so again, maybe I'm underrating it, and the coming weeks are a fine time to test it, but my instinct is that traditional anti-burn tech that does double, triple duty in lots of other matches, like Collective Brutality, like Kitchen Finks, is going to be a superior option to Weather the Storm, simply because of how our deck operates. Alright, my friends, and next up we have a very exciting card to talk about, the Collector Ouphe, and I again still don't know if it's Ouphe or Ouphe. I guess we're going to call it the Ouphe, but in any case, let's just call him the Collector. First of all, look at this guy. Like, I like serious cards a little bit more. I've never really loved the silver bordered sets. I've never really loved the kind of zany, wacky type stuff like that's common in a lot of the red chaos cards or, goblins in this game or anything like that. I like my fantastical storylines a little bit more serious, maybe a little bit more melodramatic, right? But this guy, you just gotta love this guy, right? Really cool art. Look at this beard and hair. It's just amazing. Everything about this is wonderful. I think he's even holding an ether vial in his hand, so that's very cool. Now, what do we think about the card's playability? Well, I admit to being a little bit lukewarm on it at first blush, because one of my major reasons for thinking, and I've advocated this for a long, long time, ever since I've seriously been playing BGX, I have maintained that Golgari, BG the Rock, is the strongest form of BGX in the format. Stronger than Jund, stronger than Abzan. And I think now that's not a controversial opinion, but it was at the time. But I've said that's the case for a while now. And a big reason I've specifically preferred Golgari to Abzan is because a big appeal to playing Abzan is access to Stony Silence. And I don't think our archetype strictly needs a Stony Silence. I think against most artifact-based decks, our matchup ranges from fine to very good, because we play all of this removal that does hit the non-creature permanents, because they can struggle to deal with some of our premier threats, so on and so forth. Therefore, I'm like, okay, so a green Stony Silence, pretty cool when I saw this card, but, I've come this far without Stony Silence. I don't really think I need one, and of course it's on a bear, it's on a 2/2 stick, so much more easily removed, right? But the more I looked at this card, and the more I looked at the meta, the more I liked it. Because, number one, I think generally speaking, it's fine to assume that bears, are sometimes a downgrade at least over enchantment versions of their effect because they are easier to remove. But specifically against artifact decks, that might not really be the case. Traditional Affinity plays a couple Galvanic Blasts, maybe. Maybe 4 Galvanic Blasts. Maybe that's still more or less stuck. You've got a few Dismembers out of Hardened Scales, a few Spatial Contortions or Dismembers or whatever out of the Thran decks, but honestly, their removal is pretty few and far between, and it's already kind of taxed to the limit. Like, turn 2 Bob or Goyf can be a big problem for those decks, right? So, the Collector here just gives them another creature that their very small amounts of removal really has to answer, and it is a must answer really for those decks. And the thing that really sealed the deal for me on this card, and really thinking it's good, is the Thran matchup. So the fact that it comes down turn 2 and is a clock and really, really hampers so many early Tron progressions is absolutely amazing. The Dark Confidant clock against Tron is extremely relevant, and the Collector Ouphe clock is just as relevant with the additional upside of not dying to a turn 2 Walking Ballista as a 1/1 just trading off with our Bob. You got to do better than that to take care of this guy. You know, this guy's a little bit more resilient than that. So, yeah, the Tron matchup is what tipped this over the edge for me. This is a really nice effect. Obviously, Stony Silence, even if I don't think our archetype strictly needs it, it's obviously a really strong effect in Modern. It's going to make the stupid Karn the Great Creator, Mycosynth Lattice decks, think twice before trying to lock us out, because of course, all permanents become artifacts with Lattice around, and the Collector may not look so favorably upon that. And of course, like I said, the fact that it's a body, I think, is going to be a feature more often than a bug against the decks where we want this guy. On top of everything else, it's a nice friendly casting cost. The fact that it's a green card that only costs 1 green mana is really nice for our deck. And the fact that it's a 2-drop is totally amazing, just fits really nicely within our shell. And one of the dangers, actually, of clustering around the 2-drop slot is our vulnerability to engineered explosives. And of course, they can't activate EE with the Collector around, so it's just awesome on so many levels. Of course, Blast Zone is a little bit of a way to get around that, but you understand the point. The point is that the liabilities on this card compared to Stony Silence are actually not that big of liabilities in the context of our deck. And in fact, the fact that it's a 2/2 that can get busy clocking Tron is probably going to make this a must-have inclusion for the meta as it stands. Now, again, we can rumble with the artifact decks pretty well without it, but he'll be a welcome sight there. It'll be interesting to see how good this is against Ether Vial decks. Still might not be that good because, of course, a lot of those decks do side out Vial against us, and most of those have a good big board presence, obviously, that our 2/2 might be pretty unimpressive against. But, depending on your 75, depending on what you see from the opponent and so on, there are a lot of decks where this guy could be surprisingly useful, but namely it is going to be a must-answer hoser to the artifact-dependent decks, and it is going to be amazing against Tron. Therefore, right now I'm thinking, just because we have so many cards to test, I'm going to just try it as a 1-of in the sideboard, but right now my recommendation would be play at least 1, play up to 2. 1 to 2 in the sideboard for the Collector Ouphe. Great addition to our archetype. Very, very happy with this one, my friends. Okay, so last but certainly not least, we have the innocuous-seeming common rarity reprint of this card, Unearth. So you're looking at, of course, the beloved old frame, old school art, and we've also got this new printing as well. I mean, this is pretty cool too. There's no question about it. I'm just a sucker for the old frame, but in any case, let's look at the newer one because I guess it has more updated wording. Return target creature card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, and you can do that for 1 black mana as a sorcery, and it cycles for 2 colorless mana. So what does this mean? Well, this means that arguably one of the more powerful reanimator cards in the game has entered the format, but one that doesn't cheat out the absolutely, single-handedly game-winning one. So in other words, this is a reanimator-style card that serves value decks more than it serves combo decks. Therefore, it seems to be right up our alley. We have the entirety of our creature suite, with the exception of Kalidas, Trader of Get, is able to be bought back with Unearth. So first of all, let's think of that. It goes directly to the battlefield, so this is a very unusually tempo-positive play for a deck like ours. We're a very poor... We trade very poorly as far as tempo is concerned. Discard is a tempo-negative effect, and it's kind of the defining interaction of our deck, right? But Unearth changes that. Unearth, we can buy back a Tireless Tracker, immediately play a land, and immediately start cracking clues. we can buy back a Scavenging Ooze and immediately start activating it. We can even buy back the Collector Ouphe and just start hosing the opponent's artifacts yet again. Remember how I said that they have removal already spread very thin against us, decks like Affinity and Hardened Scales and Thran? Well, it just got even worse with Unearth buying back the Ouphe or buying back whatever else is causing them a big headache, right? So Unearth, just buying back a good old-fashioned Dark Confidant or Tarmogoyf, it's going to be a lot safer to run out your one and only Bob into potential removal early on if you've got an Unearth in hand waiting as a backup plan. Now, there are so many powerful value plays based out of the graveyard. Everything from Lingering Souls and Abzan decks to the all-in Traverse builds to more fringe stuff like Grizzly Salvage or Unburial Rites, like value plans. Modern abounds with graveyard-based synergies that, kind of by definition with the stronger ones, trade favorably on the value scale. The big problem, and the big reason another reason I've always rated the Rock more highly than Abzan or Traverse Rock, for example, is that we are not graveyard dependent. So I am very leery of becoming more graveyard dependent, and that, my friends, is the beauty of Unearth, because for a mere 2 mana, you can cycle it away if it's just not live, if it's just not what we want to be doing, we cash it in for a new card. So between the fact that it cycles and between the fact that if it's good, it's tempo positive relative to a lot of, our very, very fair, pay 3 mana for a 3-drop. We're, the only deck in Modern, basically, that's not cheating on mana somehow anymore. This is going to give our deck some much-needed velocity. It also, if you recall my previous video, the discussion about cards like Regrowth and Genesis and how they stack up next to Eternal Witness, the big selling point for playing with cards like that is that they offer a form of card selection. Now, granted, they offer, especially Regrowth and Witness, offer broader card selection than Unearth, because Unearth only hits creatures, whereas those cards can take back lands or non-creature spells. However, Unearth still does give us a form of card selection as well, so the velocity, the selection, the efficiency, it's all very, very nice for us, and you can imagine how this card, or maybe you can't imagine, but that's where I'm thinking, it's going to change our archetype for the better. Now, it's not going to revolutionize our archetype totally, we're not going to do anything we're not already doing necessarily, but this is going to give us some real efficiency and power in the mid-game. You think of how good it is to immediately recur Fulminator Mage. One of the best things we can do in matchups where Fulminator Mage is good is buy it back with Liliana the Last Hope. Well, that's still good, but you know what's even better is just unearthing it and immediately returning it to the table, and immediately activating it again if that's what the situation calls for. So it's just absolutely awesome. And, some people have been grumbling about, it's Commander Horizons. We see more Commander cards than Modern playable cards. And I've thought for a while that a lot of that is they see this big, flashy mythic rare that clearly won't do anything in Modern. I've thought for a while now that a lot of the set's power will be contained at the common and uncommon rarities, which is amazing because it shows that they're printing flexible, main deckable cards that require decision making like this, rather than the latest I win button. And it also is, of course, decent financial on the financial axis as well. So, how are we going to use Unearth? Well, that remains to be seen. But I think, due to the fact that it does cycle, due to the fact that Game 1 there's not that much opposing grave hate going on, and also due to the fact that it does synergize really well with some of our proactive main deckable cards like Liliana, both Lilianas really, but especially Lily of the Veil, and Collective Brutality. I think this is a main deck card. Now, some people have said, well, it's a sideboard card that comes in for grindy matchups. I think it's so much more than that. I think Game 1, the floor on this card is just cycle for 2, so that's awesome. And 2 colorless, mind you. That's huge. That is absolutely huge that cost is colorless. And the ceiling is just absolutely through the roof. So I think main deck is probably where I'm going to personally begin with iterating on builds involving Unearth. And I think 2 is the number that I'm looking at right now. Now, of course, that's subject to change with the rest of the set. I don't know how clunky it would be to see multiples in an average game. Probably on the clunky side. So I think 2 is just enough to keep our deck chugging along and to see it a good amount of the time and to get lots of value out of it. But it's few enough that we're not going to get bogged down by them and spend our turns desperately cycling away a dead card while we die. So 2 is probably the safe starting point, and we can go up or we can go down or we can move to the side from there. But I think this card is definitely going to see play, and ironically enough, because it's a common, this might actually be the very best card overall that we've seen for our archetype. Regardless of that, whether or not that's true, it's definitely a top 5 one of the stuff we've seen, no question, and I am extremely excited about the prospect of Unearth coming to our deck. It's also worth briefly mentioning that the fact that we are main decking Scavenging Ooze, we're one of the only decks doing so. Really, BGX decks are the only ones doing so. Maybe the core decks have a one of to tutor for or whatever, but we're the best Scavenging Ooze deck in the format, and we can therefore interact with opposing Unearths really well as well against decks that will try to potentially leverage this, like Grixis Shadow, for instance. So in any case, very, very cool, very excited about this card. Of course, my friends, let me know what you think about it, but I'm going to be trying it as a 2 of in the main deck. Okay, so that was the latest batch of Modern Horizons spoilers, my friends. Welcome once again to our brand new Patreon supporters, D.A. Binder and Schneier, Confidant and Tireless tier, respectively. Thank you so much for your support, and thank you as always to all Patreon supporters. Remember, my friends, if you are liking this content, Patreon is the best way to help give back, to help it grow. It does mean it make a big difference in my life as a working father. It means a lot to me, so thanks again for your support in any way you can help the channel grow. I would dearly appreciate that, and of course I want to know what you think. Let me know if there's anything I haven't talked about that you'd like me to talk about. I want to be as thorough as possible with this momentous set, truly historical addition to Modern here, and we want to make sure we cover all our bases and give every card its due. So let me know what you think about what I said here and perhaps what I did not say, and of course stay tuned to the channel, because not only do we have Part 4 coming up when we have another batch of cards to review, we also have, as always, more League gameplay coming down the pipeline for you. Thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you all soon. I hope you have a wonderful night.